Hey everybody, thanks for joining me for my session for the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Let's go ahead and dive in, and I'll talk to you tell you a little bit about my session. My session's all about getting Microsoft 365 Developer Certified. This is your on-ramp to the MS600 exam. I'm going to explain what that is, what the certification is, what the exam is. I'm going to go through all of that in this session, and I'm also going to give you a little bit of insight into the content that you're going to find on the exam. Real briefly, my name is Andrew Connell. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I'm also involved with the Microsoft 365 Patterns and Practices group. Been doing SharePoint development for about 17 years now, and been involved in a lot of the Microsoft 365 development for a while as well. I have a podcast I co-host, and I also have a training business where I focus on SharePoint framework courses today. Now, let's talk a little bit here about what the content's all about. This is all about the exam. It's all about the Microsoft 365 Certified Developer Associate exam. And why should you listen to me talk about this? Well, because I've taken it. I took the exam. I actually was also involved in helping Microsoft create the certification and the self-paced learning content. I didn't write any questions, so that's not a trick that I had or an ace up my sleeve that I had to pass the exam. I had to take the exam just like everybody else. So as you see here, this is the proof that I've taken it and then I passed. I took it at the beginning of January in 2020. And you can see how I did in all the different areas. Clearly, I'm not as strong in some areas like Office add-ins as I am in others like SharePoint and Graph and Identity. But, you know, hey, at least I was able to pass. The nice thing is about the exam is you only need a 70% or 700 points out of 1,000 in order to pass the exam. And in my case, as you can see here, I got a 863. So most of my scores were above 90% in Identity, Graph, and SharePoint. In Teams, I was a little bit around 85, and I was in the about mid 70s for the Office add-ins. So that's how you can know you can actually trust me. I actually know what I'm doing with this. Now, when I took it, just as some context, I took the beta exam. It is no longer available in beta, and that was just a preview that Microsoft was giving to a lot of people and trying to get them to take the exam in exchange for a cheaper rate to take the exam, and that was so they could get some information on how people were doing with the exam and to make sure that they had the right questions and the questions were fair, and people who were supposed to be passing it were getting certain questions right. So let me talk to you a little bit here first about the certification itself and the exam and how Microsoft measures people. So the exam itself is what you see there right in the middle of the slide. It's Microsoft 365 Certified Developer Associate. So how do you become Microsoft Certified, or what does it mean to become M365 Certified Developer Associate? Well, what this means is that Microsoft has validated through an exam that you have that you have knowledge at the level of an associate level knowledge. Now, what does that mean? What does associate level knowledge mean? Well, the way that Microsoft does Microsoft Learning and they measure people's experience is in 3 different levels. You've got the foundational level, you've got the associate level, and you've got an expert level. And the way that they look at these is that at the foundational level, think of somebody as that's like a technical sales professional, like a TSP. If you're familiar with that role at Microsoft. And what that person can do is they can walk into a customer who can explain what their problem is or what they're trying to solve. And as somebody with the foundational knowledge can get out a whiteboard or get out an iPad or something, and they can sketch out a solution and they can explain, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to build out for you. They may not be able to do it, but they at least know the technical capabilities of how things work and what's possible. They're not going to suggest that you're going to be able to take Microsoft Teams and deploy it on-prem because it's a hosted solution. So in that case, that's a foundational level. Somebody with the associate level experience is someone who, they don't really say this, but the way that I see it is that, or the way that they see it is somebody who has 4 years of experience or equivalent. Now, clearly, nobody has 4 years of Microsoft Teams or 4 years of SharePoint framework experience. The products haven't been around that long, but it's something equivalent. You're looking for knowledge at that level to get a good idea of what they're testing you on. Now, how do you get certified? Oh, well, what more is the expert level? And an expert is someone who is they're at the teaching level. They can teach this content. They can teach someone who's at the foundational level to get up to the associate level. Now, how do you become certified, right? How do you become certified? What does that mean? Well, think of this certification as like your trophy for passing a single exam, the MS600 Building Applications and Solutions with Microsoft 365 Core Services. This exam is going to focus on 5 different workloads. We're going to go through those in this session in just a minute. But you're going to go through 5. You have to pass the exam on 5 different workloads. The exam is focused at the associate level. So if you have hands-on experience and you can build solutions and all these different workloads, then you're in good shape. Remember, you don't have to be an expert at all of these different workloads. As you saw from my example, and I showed you that for a reason, clearly there's one area that I'm not nearly as strong at as I am the other ones. So you don't have to feel like you've got to be an expert across all of these to be in good shape and be able to pass this. The links that you see on the slide, those are just short links. They're all lowercase, and they will take you to the Microsoft pages for these different things. One thing about this exam, so the MS600, you don't have to know anything that is not core in this technology. So for example, you don't have to know about React. You don't have to have an experience with patterns and practices stuff. You don't have to be an administrator or know how to configure and deploy things. Nothing about licensing. This is a developer certification. This exam is going to test you on developer stuff. The certification is focused on the developer-oriented stuff. There are different exams and certifications for people who want to understand things at different levels and for IT pro versus dev. Now, in the rest of this session, I want to spend time looking at each of the 5 different workloads that you're going to be tested on. These are the 5 workloads. It's going to be Microsoft Identity, which really is just Azure AD in the context of the exam, and I'll explain why in a minute. Microsoft Graph, SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, and Office add-ins. Now, a couple things to keep in mind about this across the board. As I already mentioned, that this is going to focus just on the dev topics. In addition, this is primarily focused on Microsoft 365. That's the hosted solutions. So SharePoint on-prem, or if you do SharePoint framework stuff on SharePoint 2016 or 2019, there are some things you're going to be tested on that you haven't had to work with or been able to work with because they're only available in Microsoft 365. Same thing is true for Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Teams. Those are hosted things. They're not available on-prem. So this is primarily all about what's in the Microsoft 365 Intelligent Cloud. In addition, most of the code is all going to be associated or focused on .NET Core and or TypeScript/JavaScript. If it's client side, it's TypeScript JavaScript. If it's server side, it's a mix of TypeScript and Node and .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. So those are the languages and the technologies you're going to be tested on. You're not going to have to know React. You may see some stuff about React, but you don't have to know React. Okay, you're not going to be tested on it because React is not required to do any of this development. It's an enabling technology for productivity, but it's not required. Let's first look at what kind of things you need to know about related to Microsoft Identity. Now, I said a minute ago that Microsoft Identity is only going to focus on Azure AD, and that's true. Microsoft Identity generally means Microsoft accounts and Azure Active Directory. But because we're working in Microsoft 365, we're not interested in MSAs or Microsoft accounts or consumer services. We're focused on the business side, and that's going to be the work and school accounts or Azure Active Directory. So that's the part you really need to know. In addition, the things you need to know. How do you register an application? And how do you use the Azure AD Admin Center? And what are the different things related to registering an application? What is multi-tenant, single-tenant? What's the difference between those? What's the difference between using what does it mean to use the implicit flow versus like the client credentials flow or the authorization code flow? How do you grant permissions to your app, or how do you at least define permissions statically to your app? How is your app going to obtain permissions dynamically through dynamic consent or incrementally through dynamic consent? How are you going to be able to grant like a secret or a certificate to your app for people to be able to authenticate and use it? All those things are things you need to know about when it comes to registering an application. Another thing you need to know, how do you implement authentication? And what I mean by that is, how do you implement it on a console app or a web API, like a REST API, or a ASP.NET MVC or style application that you would use .NET Core with? So how would you use MSAL to do those things, the Microsoft Authentication Library? How do you configure permissions to consume an API? How do you set up an application, an Azure AD application, to make calls to Microsoft Graph? What kind of permissions does it need? What kinds of things do you have to set up? You need to know about that stuff. How do you implement authorization and consume an API? So how would I set up my ASP.NET MVC Core web application to support someone logging in using a work and school account and then being able to fetch information about that user using the Microsoft Graph? And then finally, how would I create a web service that's secured with Azure AD to talk to Microsoft Graph? Those are all topics that you're going to need to know and you're going to need to be familiar with and what you're going to be tested on. The next workload that you're going to be tested on, Microsoft Graph. This takes up about 20 to 25% of the questions that you're going to see on the exam. You're going to need to know how to primarily work with the SDK, the Microsoft Graph SDKs that are provided, but you're also going to want to know how the REST API works. You're going to need to understand how to work with query parameters, how to use things like $select, $filter, $order by, $top, $skip. Those different query parameters are going to allow you to control what happens in the query, should you filter things out, what's your where clause, and then how much data you get back, both in the number of fields and the amount of data returned from using like the top and the skip properties. Microsoft is also very interested in making sure that you're familiar with a very hot topic these days, and that's throttling. You know those 429s? You should be able to identify how or what a 429 is, how to address it in your code, and how to mitigate it in your code, and why you're getting it. So you're going to want to understand how to deal with that in your code and how to go through and to build your application in a way to avoid getting hit with those 429s as best you can. But when you do get hit with them, how you deal with it. You should know how to do that stuff. There are 3 specific entities or resources that are going to be focused on, that the exam is going to focus on. And that's users, files, and groups. How do you upload a file? How do you upload a small file? How do you upload a large file? How do you get a file from a SharePoint document library using Microsoft Graph? How do you get it from a OneDrive folder using Microsoft Graph? You're going to need to know how to do those things. You're going to need to know how to read, write, and find and create users, and the same thing with groups. How do you create a group? How do you find groups? How do you find all the groups a user is a member of or an owner of? How do you teamify a group? Things like that. And then the last 2 things are things related to the 429s. How do you create more performant applications? How do you set up webhooks so you can be notified of when things change, so you're not constantly polling Microsoft Graph? How can you track changes that have happened to entities since the last time you made a call to Microsoft Graph? You want to check for all of that stuff. So those are all things that you should pay attention to and you should be familiar with. When it comes to SharePoint, we're going to focus on the SharePoint framework and declarative customizations. You don't have to know anything about the server-side stuff. You don't have to know anything about CSOM. I don't remember any CSOM questions that came up or any of the study materials. But what you do have to know is how to create a web part and the parts about and the components of a web part and the different ways we can use it inside of a SharePoint online environment, both as a web part, as a full-page app, how to deal with if it's an isolated web part, stuff like that. You need to know about extensions, where they're available and how to use them. You need to understand about the deployment story, the build, the bundle, the package solution, the different flags between dev and production, the different deployment options. So tenant scoped and site collection scoped app catalogs. What does a tenant-wide deployment of an extension mean? Stuff like that. And then you need to know how to integrate data from external sources. For example, how do I get data from Microsoft Graph from the SharePoint framework? How do I get data from an Azure AD secured API? Right? How would you do that? If it's an out-of-the-box one, or even if it's a custom API that you wanted to call. You don't have to know how to create the custom API, but just know how to call it. And then how do I use a web part to query or to add as a custom tab in Microsoft Teams. How would you go about doing that? That's something else you need to know about. And then finally, on the SharePoint side, you're also going to need to know about branding and theming as it's related to SharePoint. And specifically, you need to understand declarative customizations, that site scripts and site designs, and then list formatting, so column and row level formatting. There's not a lot of questions on declarative formatting or declarative customizations, but there are some questions, and it will be a topic that you could be tested on. All right, now let's look at Teams, the third workload. Now, Microsoft Teams, you need to know about the different extensibility points that are available to you. You need to know how to work with custom tabs and how you can define a custom tab and create them both as personal tabs or configurable tabs, and how you can leverage them using web pages or using adaptive cards. You also need to know how to work with webhooks inside of Microsoft Teams, both as an incoming webhook or an Office 365 connector, and as an outgoing webhook. You need to understand messaging extensions. So how can I go through and kind of embellish an existing message or embellish the compose area by creating an existing message, including link unfurling. And then finally, you need to understand how to work with conversational bots as well. How do you create a bot? How do you interact with it? And how do you add it to a custom app in Teams? I almost forgot. The other thing you need to know too, how to deal with dialogues. We call these things task modules. That's something else you need to know how to work with task modules, both as a web page and as an adaptive card. So you should know how to work with those as well. It's a lot of stuff I'm going through. I'm going through it pretty quick, but I'm gonna have some resources for you at the very end. It's only so much we can cover in 30 minutes. I said this was your on-ramp, so I hope that when you got on the highway, you just floored it and you're going 100 miles an hour by the time, or 150 kilometers an hour. I don't know. I'm talking in American units. So I guess kilometers an hour is a little more international, a little more galactic. Let's just go with light years, light speed. There we go. That's more galactic. Okay, now the next workload that you need to be aware of is one called Office add-ins. And so these are the things that you can customize or extend Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook by creating custom task panes or content add-ins. So you need to understand the concepts of working with add-ins. How do I go about creating an add-in? What's required? What does it mean? The fact that it's going to be living inside of an iframe like a tab is in Microsoft Teams, and it needs to be hosted somewhere else. How does my add-in communicate with the host Office client application? It does that using Office.js. How do you do that? How do you hook up to it? You need to understand those things. How do I customize add-ins? How do I add buttons to the ribbon, right? How do I get access to the information on the current email or a new calendar item that I'm creating or reading inside of Outlook? Then you need to understand what the deployment story is, what the testing story is, what the debugging story is, and then what the deployment story is with an add-in. What do I need to do? What parts do I need to deploy to my tenant? What parts do I need to host myself somewhere else? Those are all things you should know. We didn't mention it on the last section, but you do need to know those exact same things when it comes to Microsoft Teams as well. In terms of your customizations, not how you deploy Microsoft Teams, but how you deploy your customizations so they can be surfaced in Microsoft Teams. And then another thing you want to understand when it comes to Office add-ins is actionable messages. So you need to understand how you can leverage, say, adaptive cards to create more engaging messages in your application, in your Office, your Outlook-based application that you're creating. So when you send an email to someone through a registered email address and provider, that you can have them interact with your application using adaptive cards without ever leaving the Office Outlook client. So those are all things that you need to be aware of. Look, that was a lot of information here, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that we just went through, and there's only so much that we can cover throughout this entire, throughout this session. Again, a couple things I want to run through with this, or let me explain what this is, and I'll come back and I'll give you a couple like tips and tricks of things resources to go take a look at. So if you want to learn more about this, I spent about an hour for each one of these different workloads throughout the month of May in a 6-part webinar series where we went through each one of the different series or each one of the different workloads in about an hour. Keeping with the Galactic Collaboration Summit theme, we went on 6 different voyages. So voyage 1 through 6, it went through each one of the different workloads. All of these are recordings that are available to you if you want to go grab them on your own. You can go watch them on demand, stream them. They're all available right now. Just use that link at the bottom of the slide where it says vtns.io, get M365 Dev Certified Series. That is a case-sensitive link. So you go there, you'll go straight to a blog post that has links to all the recordings where you can go see each one of these different sessions. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about how you should approach the exam and some ways of studying and getting a feel for it. And getting a feel for, are you at the level to go take the exam? So one of the things that I've worked with Microsoft a lot on over the last year is I was involved with them to help create the topics or to define the topics that people could and should be tested on, should be tested on when it comes to Microsoft 365 certification. That included things like sitting down and we defined this huge Excel spreadsheet where we created all of this content. And when we did this, we went through a couple different revisions on it. It was part some people in the community like myself, and then some people at Microsoft that were on the different product groups, but between the identity team and the graph team and the SharePoint team and the Office add-in team and the Microsoft Team team, and also some people with Microsoft Learning. And when we went through all of this, we kind of whittled it down, what were the most important things, and et cetera. And then from there, what that generated was this artifact of a giant Excel spreadsheet that had everything that they needed. Before you ask, no, I can't give you this spreadsheet. I don't even have it. But they had this huge spreadsheet, and they used that spreadsheet as the kind of like the spec for the entire certification. So this went to people that were creating an instructor-led course that you could get from Microsoft, for self-paced study content that you could get from Microsoft, and the people who are writing the exam questions. Now, I didn't write the exam questions. I wasn't involved in that process, conflict of interest. But I wasn't involved in that whole process because I'm involved. I do training and education stuff as my business on the side, and it wouldn't be fair, or it would be a conflict of interest if I knew the questions and then turn around and I write courses for that. So that wasn't going to be allowed. I wasn't involved in the instructor-led course either for various reasons, but I was involved in creating all of the self-paced study content. Now, what the cool thing is with this is Microsoft provides this on the Microsoft Learning site. So if you go to docs.microsoft.com/learn, you will find learning paths for each one of these different workloads. And each of the learning paths contains anywhere from 4 to 6 modules on various topics. And it was all the topics that I went throughout this webinar. So you'll be able to go back and you'll see that, oh, here's all the things that I need to know. I would go through those different modules inside those different learning paths. And that's going to give you a good feel to where if you're reading through this and you feel really comfortable with the content, that's going to tell you that, hey, I should feel comfortable going to take this exam. If you don't feel comfortable with the content, that's the stuff you need to study. We only put stuff inside of that self-paced learning content, that's stuff that you would find in that Excel spreadsheet, which is the stuff that was used to generate the questions or build the questions by the question writers. So that's a great way, and it's totally free. It's a great way for you to go check out how to go about doing that stuff, what's going to be on the exam, what real topics are there. I went through all those topics pretty quick in this webinar we had, because again, we've only got 30 minutes, but you were able, if you want more information on these different topics, you can run through each one of the different webinars that I have listed here with a link on the slide. And you can go to the Microsoft Learn site to go learn more about that as well. Hey, I really hope that you got a lot out of this. If you've got any questions, please feel free to go ahead and post them, and happy to go through and answer any questions that you may have with this. My contact info is at the beginning of this session as well. And so you can reach out to me if you have any questions going forward with this, with the MS600 exam. I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy. It's been an interesting start to the 2020 year. Unfortunately, we couldn't do an event like this in person right now, but next best thing, we're all doing this online. Kind of makes sense, right? We're all doing it in the cloud. Microsoft 365, it's in the cloud, so it kind of makes sense we're doing it. But I'd still love to be in a room and being able to talk to all of you in person. Thanks a lot for the organizers of this event for putting this on the Galactic Collaboration Summit. I love being involved in the event, and definitely make sure you take a look at the in-person events related to the Collaboration Summit as well, coming up in the future. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.